Let's open in our Bibles now to Nehemiah chapter 2. Nehemiah chapter 2. And this morning we're going to be looking at the first 10 verses. We'll be focusing on one main theme in these 10 verses. And that is the bold request that Nehemiah was resolved to make of the king. So looking down then at Nehemiah chapter 2 and beginning at verse 1, please give your attention to the reading of God's holy word. In the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, I took up the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had not been sad in his presence. And the king said to me, "Why is your face sad, seeing you are not sick? This is nothing but sadness of the heart." Then I was very much afraid. I said to the king, "Let the king live forever. Why should not my face be sad, when the city, the place of my father's graves, lies in ruins, and the gates have been destroyed by fire?" Then the king said to me, "What are you requesting?" So I prayed to the God of heaven, and I said to the king, "If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's graves, that I may rebuild it." And the king said to me, the queen sitting beside him, "How long will you be gone, and when will you return?" So it pleased the king to send me when I had given him a time. And I said to the king, "If it pleases the king, let letters be given to me to the governors of the province beyond the river, that they may let me pass through until I come to Judah, and a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he may give me timber to make beams for the gates of the fortress of the temple, and for the wall of the city, and for the house that I shall occupy." And the king granted me what I asked, for the good hand of my God was upon me. And thus far the reading of God's holy word. Now, this is an incredible passage of Scripture, and I hope that we can appreciate what is taking place here, because they show us a tremendously outrageous request that Nehemiah made to the king. Now, we began looking at this study of Nehemiah by noticing the great concern and the great sorrow that Nehemiah had for the condition of Jerusalem. The condition of Jerusalem. This book begins with Nehemiah's concern and sorrow. Verse 2 tells us that when Nehemiah was introduced from men who were visiting from Jerusalem, from Judah, he asked about the condition of the city of Jerusalem and the people there. Now, Nehemiah lived thousands of miles away. He lived in Babylon. He was born in Babylon. He had never been to Jerusalem, and yet his heart concern, his interest was not upon the Persian Empire, not upon the city where he lived. He wasn't focused on this world and the nations of this world. His heart was focused on the city of God, on Jerusalem. Now, why was Nehemiah so interested and concerned about Jerusalem? Because Jerusalem was the one city in the world where the Lord had put his name. During the Old Testament time, before Christ came, Jerusalem symbolized where God dwelt. That's where God's house was, God's temple. Jerusalem symbolized where God dwelt with his people. It was the city of God's house. It was the place from which the gospel was particularly preached with absolute clarity. Jerusalem was the city that symbolized the church. You know, there are some things about all of us here in this room. There are some things about us that we share in common with Nehemiah. Do you know one of the things that you and I share in common with Nehemiah? It's not how we dress. It's not the food we eat. It's not where we live. One thing that you and I share in common with Nehemiah is the songs that we sing in worship. We have the same hymn book that Nehemiah had. You might not think much of that, particularly young people who have grown up in the church. You've always sung these psalms. But for most Christians in the world today, they don't sing the same songs that Nehemiah sung. But we do. We sing the same songs. And just as Nehemiah sang Psalm 135, "Blessed be the Lord from Zion, he who dwells in Jerusalem." You and I sing that. Or Psalm 68, "Because your temple at Jerusalem, O God, kings shall bear gifts to you." You and I sing that, just as Nehemiah sang that. Or Psalm 48, we sang this at the beginning of our service. "Great is the Lord, and greatly to be praised in the city of our God, his holy mountain, beautiful in elevation, is the glory of all the earth, Mount Zion, in the far north, the city of the great King. As we have heard, so we have seen in the city of the Lord of hosts, in the city of God, our God, which God will establish forever." You and I sing that song, just as Nehemiah sang that song. Or Psalm 87, "Glorious things are spoken of you, O city of God." And then that Hebrew word that you find in the Psalms, Selah. In other words, think about this. Meditate. Glorious things are said about Jerusalem. Or Psalm 122. "I was glad when they said to me, 'Let us go to the house of the Lord. Our feet have been standing within your gates, O Jerusalem.' Psalm 116. "I will pay my vows to the Lord in the presence of all his people, in the courts of the house of the Lord, in the midst of you, O Jerusalem." We sing these psalms just as Nehemiah sang these songs. And just as Jesus and the apostles sang these songs. Nehemiah would have sung them along with Psalm 79, which we read. "O God, the nations have come into your inheritance. They have defiled your holy temple. They have laid Jerusalem in ruins." And he would have sung Psalm 51, the psalm that David was inspired to write when Nathan the prophet went to him after he committed adultery with Bathsheba. And what do we find in Psalm 51? "Do good to Zion in your good pleasure. Build up the walls of Jerusalem. Then you will delight in right sacrifices, burnt offerings and whole burnt offerings. Then bulls will be offered on your altar." Nehemiah, like all of us here, sang these psalms in worship. And that tells us how his heart was shaped by these psalms to have a love and a concern and a burden for Jerusalem. And as you and I sing these same songs, which we know are about the church, for Hebrews 12:22 says, "But you have come to Mount Zion and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem." That's the church. Jerusalem was in Nehemiah's heart. He was concerned for its condition, for the state of its people. And so when he heard this report that the walls of Jerusalem lay in ruins and that the Jews there were in trouble and shame, he wept. Well, are you concerned about the condition, the state of the church. He was full of sorrow. And the reason why he was sad about this is because he was a godly man. There are many things that break our heart, many things that bring us sorrow. But surely one of them should be when the church lay in ruins. That should be a concern. And so we read in Nehemiah chapter 1 and verse 4, "As soon as I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for days." That was Nehemiah's concern. That's how this letter opened up. And Nehemiah was praying then for an opportunity to speak to the king and to make an extremely bold request. And this is the first thing that I want us to look at together. Nehemiah's prayerful resolve to make an outlandish request. Nehemiah's prayerful resolve to make an outlandish request. Look at what we read in verse 11 of chapter 1. Nehemiah says, "O Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant and to the prayer of your servants who delight to fear your name, and give success to your servant today, and grant him mercy in the sight of this man." Nehemiah is resolved here, we see in these words, he's resolved here to speak to the king and to make a request of him. That's why he's praying, "Grant mercy in the sight of this man." As Nehemiah wept and mourned over the shameful condition of Jerusalem, a resolve was brewing within his heart. He would speak to the king. He would speak to the king. He would ask the king to allow him to go to Jerusalem and oversee the rebuilding of the walls. That's what's implied in verse 11. "Give success to your servant today and grant him mercy in the sight of this man." When I make this request, allow him to receive it. Nehemiah's resolved to speak to the king, to make an incredible request. Look at verse 5 of chapter 2. Verse 5 of chapter 2. "And I said to the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's graves, that I may rebuild it." And then notice again what he says in verse 7. "If it pleases the king, let letters be given to me, to the governors of the province beyond the river, that they may let me pass through until I come to Jerusalem." And then notice what else he says. "And a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he may give me timber to make beams for the gates of the fortress of the temple, and for the wall of the city, and for the house that I shall occupy." Think about this for just a moment. Think just about the first part of his request that he is thinking about, that he wants to make to the king. Jerusalem has not been rebuilt by the Jews that originally went back there for now 93 years. The first Jews that went back 93 years prior to this had not rebuilt the walls. Even Ezra, when he went back 13 years before this event, the walls were not rebuilt. And here Nehemiah is going to ask the highest king in all the world, "I, your cupbearer, want to go to Jerusalem and rebuild the city." So this is the first part of the request. "Let me, your cupbearer, the servant who pours your wine into your cup, let me go to Jerusalem and rebuild the city," which you up to this point really haven't had any interest in doing. And this is not all. Nehemiah has been thinking about his request. He knows what it's going to require. In verse 7, let me have letters bearing your authority so that no one will stop me. And then he's also resolved to ask the king for supplies. So Nehemiah is resolved to ask for time off from his work. He's going to ask as a cupbearer to oversee the rebuilding of Jerusalem, for letters giving him authority over all the local governors, and to ask for an incredible amount of money. For what purpose? To rebuild the city of God. Now notice Nehemiah then, this is what he would be praying for when he's saying, Lord, give me success and grant mercy in the sight of this man. Nehemiah wasn't merely praying in a vague sense for the rebuilding of Jerusalem. Oh Lord, please rebuild Jerusalem if it is your will. Nehemiah wasn't merely praying, oh Lord, you can do all things, so please rebuild Jerusalem. No, verse 11 of chapter 1 says, give success to your servant me. Grant him mercy in the sight of this man. Because Nehemiah is having it in his mind, I am going to ask the king if he will let me go back to rebuild the city. If he will give me a ton of money to do this. If he will give me letters of authority so that no one will stop me. Nehemiah is determined that he wants to go, and he understands that he's going to need these letters. He understands that he will need lots of money and resources. And that's what he's resolved to ask the king. He wants to see Jerusalem rebuilt. He knows that someone has to take action. Someone has to do it. And it's in his heart. He wants to do it. And so he's resolved to make this request. Now, I want you to stop and to seriously think about what you would have said to Nehemiah if he let you in on his idea. What would you have said to Nehemiah if he told you what he was thinking about doing? Imagine you're a friend of Nehemiah, and like Nehemiah, you have a concern for Jerusalem. Like Nehemiah, you want to see the city rebuilt. Well, what would you say to Nehemiah if one day he came to you and he said, listen, I've been thinking about asking the king to give me time off to go back to Jerusalem and rebuild the walls. And I'm thinking about asking him for letters to give me authority to do that. And I'm going to ask him for a couple of $100 million to do this. What do you think? Will you pray with me about this? What would you have said to Nehemiah? Please put yourself back in his day. If you were there, if you were his friend, and he let you know about this plan to approach the king and make these requests, what would you have said to him? I fear the sad reality is that many Christians today, if they had been there, if they had been Nehemiah's friend, they would have discouraged him from doing this. Nehemiah, you're crazy. Why would the king ever allow you to do this? Why would he let you, a server of wine, have unlimited authority to oversee the rebuilding of a city? And why would he ever be willing to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on this? You're even thinking about requesting that he give you a lot of money to build you a house there? This will never happen, Nehemiah. Put the idea out of your head. Don't ask, because it might make matters worse for us. The king would never grant you this request. It will not happen. I fear this is the way many Christians today would have responded to Nehemiah. Now, that doesn't mean that they would not want Jerusalem rebuilt. They would just say, God will do it, Nehemiah. He can do it some other way. Don't try to take this into your own hands. It's crazy. God can rebuild Jerusalem, Nehemiah, and he will do so when he's ready. When God wants to, he can raise up people who will do it. But you shouldn't make such a request. This isn't wise. This is just wishful thinking. It's too charismatic, Nehemiah. You're getting into the word faith movement. I want you to notice that Nehemiah is well aware of the fact that, humanly speaking, this is a doomed request. He knows that. Nehemiah knows that such a request, humanly speaking, is outlandish. Humanly speaking, this request stands no chance of success. He's under no delusion. He knows really there's zero possibility that this is going to happen. Unless the Lord grants success. Unless the Lord grants mercy. And this is what Nehemiah is praying about. He's resolved to speak to the king and to make these requests, and he's continually praying day by day, Lord, grant success to your servant today. Grant mercy in the sight of this man. Now, allow me to encourage all of you to think more like Nehemiah did, to pray as Nehemiah prayed, especially when we think in our own context here today, a small branch of Christ Church in Canada, in a day when the church is laying in ruins, as it were. You know, one of the main reasons why our Canadian congregations of the RPCNA, constituted as the RPC, was to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem in Canada. And like Nehemiah, who understood that to rebuild Jerusalem, he would need letters from the king, he would need a vast amount of resources, and he realized that some of the things that he was seeking were, from a human point of view, an impossibility. To be a man who would oversee such a work. Well, we today as well, in these 9 small congregations in Canada, yearning for the church to be rebuilt and reformed, to flourish and to grow, to rise up. What is required? What is required? Humanly speaking, things that we cannot get. We need resources. We need buildings. We need God to raise up men for the ministry. All of these things are needed. And so we need to cultivate the same kind of prayerful heart that Nehemiah had. A realization that, humanly speaking, where is this going to come from? Yet, O Lord, grant mercy. So that's the first thing. Now, the second thing I want you to notice here is Nehemiah's waiting upon the Lord. Nehemiah's waiting upon the Lord. Look at verse 1 of chapter 2 again. In the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes. So verse 1 begins in the month of Nisan. Now that means that it has been 4 months since Nehemiah heard about the condition of Jerusalem and began praying for Jerusalem, began asking God that the Lord would grant him success as he's becoming resolved to speak to the king. It's been 4 months that Nehemiah has been resolved to make these requests to the king. And he's been waiting day by day for 4 months for this opportunity to speak. For 4 months, Nehemiah has been praying, "O Lord, give success to your servant today." And then day by day would pass along. So Nehemiah waits. Nehemiah waits. Now, again, Nehemiah has the Psalms, like you and I, right? So Psalm 27:14, wait for the Lord. Be strong and let your heart take courage. Wait for the Lord. Or Psalm 37:7, be still before the Lord and wait patiently for him. Or Psalm 41, I waited patiently for the Lord. he inclined to me and heard my cry. Nehemiah is praying and he's waiting. He's waiting for the opportunity. The Lord sometimes delays our requests. He sometimes postpones our desires and our plans. And that's because the Lord has his appointed time for everything. Isn't it interesting? We know, you and I know, that the Lord was going to allow the walls to be rebuilt. Nehemiah didn't at the beginning of his prayer. But we do. We know that. Nehemiah didn't, and he would have to wait. He would have to wait for the appointed time because the Lord has his appointed times. His appointed time when this conversation would come up with the king. His appointed time when he would go back to Jerusalem and begin to rebuild. And so Nehemiah had to wait for that time. Now remember, Jesus teaches us about God's timing. Jesus shows us very clearly that everything is predestined. Everything about the life of our Lord was all foreordained. You remember when the people of his hometown in Nazareth wanted to throw him off a cliff and kill him? And what happened? He just walked right in their midst, walked right through them, and went on his way. Why? Because his hour had not yet come. And then later in Jerusalem, the Jews pick up stones. They want to stone him. And what happens? He walks right through them. Not one of them throws a stone. Why? Because his hour had not yet come. But then on the night when he instituted the Lord's Supper, he said to Judas, "What you do, do quickly." And when Jesus was in the Garden of Gethsemane and the soldiers came to arrest him, he said, "See, the hour is at hand." God's timing. Our prayers are answered according to God's time. And he has a reason for sometimes waiting and delaying his answer. Nehemiah had been waiting for 4 months. For 4 months. Why would God wait this long to answer? Well, we notice that it's the month of Nisan that God answers this prayer. We can't know for sure, but maybe one of the reasons is that God wanted this to happen on the first month of the new year, so that people would remembering the Exodus. And this is the beginning of it, a new beginning. Right at the beginning of the new year. Maybe that could be it. But perhaps it was in order to prepare Nehemiah to speak. There's a difference between having a heart's desire to speak and thinking in your mind about, yes, I'm going to say something. There's a difference between that and then actually going and speaking. It's one thing to have a strong desire to speak up for God. We can imagine all kinds of conversations in our heads. Do you ever have those kinds of conversations? You're at work or you're in some situation. Here's what I'm going to say. This is how. And you play out the conversation. That's one thing. But when the time comes, we're often gripped with fear. And our words are choked. And nothing comes out as we planned or hoped. And perhaps the Lord delayed Nehemiah's request in order to prepare Nehemiah to speak, to make this request. Notice in verses 2 and 3. Chapter 2, verses 2 and 3. And the king said to me, "Why is your face sad, seeing you're not sick? This is nothing but sadness of the heart." Then I was very much afraid. Why did Nehemiah become afraid when the king said, "Nehemiah, why are you sad?" Because this was against the law. You know, like a waitress in a restaurant or a flight attendant, they always have to be smiling. Have you noticed that? It's like part of the job requirement. If you're going to be a waitress, you got to be smiling. You got to be friendly to the people. And not only was it inherently part of the job description of being a cupbearer, pouring the wine, to always be cheerful, have a smile on your face, be a pleasant host. It was also part of the law of the Persians. You remember in Esther chapter 4, verse 2, we read about Mordecai putting on sackcloth, and he goes to the palace of the king, but it says there that he only went to the gate of the palace. Why? It says in verse 2 of chapter 4, for no one was allowed to enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth. It was against the Persian law to be sad in the king's presence. What an insult. What a superstition. We can't have negative vibes here. Everything has to be joyful around the king. And here on this particular day, the queen is there. This was the law of the worldly king. Everyone must be happy. And here was a happy celebration. And perhaps without realizing it, Nehemiah's sorrow is being worn on his face. He's not even aware of it. Think about all the times that Nehemiah would have been thinking about, okay, when's the perfect situation where I can bring these questions before the king? Maybe just before he's ready to go to sleep and he's had a good day and he wants a little wine at the end, and then I can introduce the subject. I'll wait for something to break it, and I can break this subject to him. Nehemiah may have been thinking time and again, when is that perfect situation? And then when he's not even realizing it, all of a sudden, the king says, Nehemiah, why are you sad? And the room goes silent, and you can hear a pin drop. And Nehemiah, his heart instantly sinks. He could be expelled, he could be executed. He was very much afraid. The whole thing took him by surprise. His very life is in the balance. Why are you sad, Nehemiah? Nehemiah had been praying every day for the right opportunity to speak to the king. And do you think he ever would imagine this was how it was going to play out? That this is his perfect opportunity? No, not at all. You know, the godly get afraid. Don't think that boldness and fearlessness is one of the common fruits of the Spirit. It's not. It's a spiritual gift. 1 Corinthians 13:3, if I deliver up my body to be burned, that's a spiritual gift. It's not common. Paul wrote to the Corinthians, I was with you in weakness and in fear, much trembling. And Nehemiah was very much afraid. And perhaps one of the reasons why God delayed in answering Nehemiah's prayer is in order to work in Nehemiah the kind of courage that he would be able to muster for this time. What would have been the temptation? Nehemiah, why are you sad? Why are you sad? What would be the temptation? Oh, it's nothing. My dog died. Or I guess it wouldn't be a dog. My pet died. I had a sheep that died. Or, someone sick that I know. Something vague. You see the temptation immediately. Or, I'm not sad. I don't know why that happened. The temptation. But notice what happens after 4 months of praying and meditating. Nehemiah, what is on your mind? And the court is silent. And then Nehemiah just says, why shouldn't I be sad? What a bold thing to say. Why shouldn't I be sad? Why shouldn't I break your law in your presence? How can I help it? The city of God, the church lies in ruins. God has his timing. And sometimes his timing is in order to actually prepare us for the very thing that we are praying for. So God always has his perfect timing. Well, the Lord willing, we're going to continue through this and look at the other requests that are associated with Nehemiah speaking to the king. At this time, I'd like for us to turn to Psalm 122, the A selection. Psalm 122, selection A. We'll stand to sing and then remain standing for the benediction.